The morning started with a lie, the kind that feels harmless until it ruins you. Sunlight slipped through the curtains like it always did, soft and confident, as if it knew nothing about endings. I woke up before my alarm, stared at the ceiling, and told myself the same sentence I'd repeated for years. Just another Tuesday. Nothing special. Nothing dangerous. I showered, dressed, brewed my coffee strong, and adjusted my tie with the practiced precision of a man who believed his life was stable. Outside, the city hummed with purpose. Cars moved with intention. People walked fast, eyes forward, chasing futures they trusted would still be there by evening. I was one of them. My office desk had never been cleaner. I liked order, pens aligned, laptop centered. Not because anyone asked, but because order made me feel useful. It made me feel necessary. The badge clipped to my belt was slightly scratched from years of use, but it still opened doors. I'd earned that. Years of late nights, skipped vacations, quiet sacrifices no one applauded. I'd built a reputation as reliable, invisible, replaceable, or so I would soon learn. At 9:17 a.m., my manager sent a message. "Can you come to the conference room?" No emojis, no explanation, just 12 words that rearranged my fate. I didn't panic. Why would I? Meetings happened every day. Still, something in my chest tightened as I stood. The glass-walled room waited at the end of the hallway like an aquarium. Everyone inside exposed, silent, pretending not to look. I walked past familiar faces. Some smiled, some nodded. One colleague mouthed, "Good luck," like it was a presentation review. I smiled back. Inside the room, my manager didn't offer me a seat right away. He stood, hands clasped, eyes tired. HR was already there. That's when the air changed. It thickened, like the room had inhaled and refused to let it out. I sat slowly. My heartbeat grew loud enough to distract me from the hum of the air conditioner. He cleared his throat. "This isn't easy," he said, which is always how these things begin. He talked about restructuring, about shifting priorities, about decisions made above his level. Each sentence landed gently, carefully chosen, but together they formed something brutal. Then he said it. "We're letting you go." For a moment, I laughed. A short, confused sound escaped me before I could stop it. "I'm sorry," I said, smiling like a fool. "I think there's been a mistake." He didn't smile back. HR slid a folder across the table. My name was printed neatly on the tab. In that instant, denial collapsed. Years of effort shrank into a stack of papers. I tried to argue, not emotionally but logically. I listed projects, results, numbers, deadlines met, problems solved. My voice stayed calm, but my hands betrayed me, fingers tapping the table like they were searching for an exit. My manager listened, nodding, eyes glazed with regret he wouldn't act on. "It's not about performance," he said. "It's just business." That sentence hurt more than the decision itself. Business had no memory, no loyalty, no face. 20 minutes later, it was over. I signed where they told me to sign. I shook hands because it felt expected. HR smiled sadly. My manager avoided my eyes. A security guard waited outside the room, polite but firm. I was escorted back to my desk like a visitor overstaying their welcome. I placed my belongings into a cardboard box, a framed photo, a notebook full of ideas no one would read, a mug with a faded joke printed on it. My badge stopped working before I reached the exit. The door beeped red. The guard tapped his card instead. Outside, the world didn't pause for my collapse. The sun still shone. Traffic still roared. People still hurried to meetings that mattered to them. My phone buzzed. "Sorry to hear, man. Didn't see that coming. Let me know if you need anything." Messages stacked up, hollow and well-meaning. I sat on the concrete steps across the street and stared at the box in my lap. The building reflected the sky, tall and indifferent. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be. Silence followed, the loud kind. No emails, no calendar reminders, no responsibilities demanding attention. Just me and the echo of a life that had ended quietly, efficiently. I replayed the meeting in my head, searching for clues, for warnings I'd missed. Maybe if I'd spoken up more. Maybe if I'd played politics. Maybe if I'd been louder instead of better. Regret lined up like accusations. I stood eventually and walked without direction. Each step felt unreal, like I was borrowing someone else's body. I passed cafes where people laughed over coffee. Offices where badges still worked. A bus stop where a man complained about being late to work. I wanted to scream at him to be grateful, to cherish the annoyance of routine. Instead, I kept walking. My phone vibrated again. An unknown number. Restricted. I ignored it. Let it ring. I wasn't in the mood for scams or pity. It rang again. Something in me hesitated. A quiet instinct pushing against my exhaustion. I answered, my voice flat. Hello. The story of that call would come later. But in that moment, before any miracles, before any purpose, before anything extraordinary, I was just a man who had lost his job, his rhythm, and his certainty in the span of an ordinary morning. I didn't know it yet, but the firing I thought had destroyed me was only clearing space. Not for comfort, for something far heavier, far bigger, and far more demanding than the life I'd just lost. The phone felt heavier than it should have, like it knew something I didn't. I stood there on the sidewalk, the city moving around me, the echo of my own hello, still hanging in the air. For a second, there was nothing on the other end. Just breathing, calm, measured, the kind of breathing that belongs to someone who isn't rushed by life. Is this David? The voice finally asked. Yes, I said, instinctively straightening my back, as if posture could protect me from bad news. My mind raced through possibilities. Debt collectors, a recruiter with terrible timing, someone calling to offer condolences I didn't want. This call is being placed from the office of the president, the voice said. I laughed again, the same confused laugh from the conference room, sharp and disbelieving. Yeah, okay, I replied, already preparing to hang up. It felt cruel for someone to joke with me on a day like this. I understand this may sound unusual, the voice continued, unbothered by my reaction. But please stay on the line. Something stopped me. Not hope, not excitement, curiosity maybe, or exhaustion. I lowered the phone from my ear and stared at the screen. Still restricted. No name, no number. My thumb hovered over the end call button. Then the voice spoke again, firmer now, closer. David, are you still there? Yes, I said quietly. Good. One moment, please. There was a pause, then a soft click. The background noise changed. It was quieter now, controlled. And then I heard him. A voice I recognized instantly, not because I'd ever met him, but because it had lived in my living room for years, spilling out of televisions during speeches and national addresses. Steady, familiar, weighted with authority. Son, the voice said, I heard about what happened today. My legs gave way. I sat down hard on the low wall behind me, the cardboard box tilting dangerously at my feet. I'm sorry, I said, my throat suddenly dry. Who is this? The voice chuckled softly, not mockingly, but with warmth. I think you know. Time slowed, stretched thin like glass about to shatter. Mr. President? I whispered. Yes, he said. No introduction, no ceremony, just a confirmation that rearranged reality. I looked around as if cameras might be hidden somewhere, as if this were an elaborate test. People passed by without noticing that my world had just tilted off its axis. I think there's been a mistake, I said again, clinging to logic. I'm nobody. That's what makes this call important, he replied. I swallowed. My heartbeat pounded in my ears so loudly I was afraid he could hear it. Sir, I said, struggling to find the right words, I just lost my job. I know, he said gently, and I know how that feels. That surprised me more than the call itself. Presidents weren't supposed to understand that kind of loss. They were insulated from it, protected. With respect, I said, I don't understand why you're calling me. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. Because sometimes the people who do the most meaningful work are the ones who never get recognized for it. I closed my eyes. Images of late nights flashed through my mind. Empty offices. Code running while the rest of the building slept. Fixing problems that would never be traced back to me. I was just doing my job, I said. No, he corrected. You were doing more than that. And someone noticed. My fingers tightened around the phone. Who? I did. The word landed heavy. How? I asked. He explained how a report had crossed his desk weeks ago. How a small, overlooked project had quietly solved a problem no one else could. How it had been passed along without fanfare, stripped of names, focused only on results. I asked who built it, he said. Your name came up. I asked again, and again. Eventually, I read everything I could about you. My mouth went dry. I thought of the project he was talking about, the one I'd worked on during weekends, refining it because it mattered to me, not because anyone demanded it. I'd assumed it would disappear into the system like everything else I did. I'm not calling to offer you a job, the president said, interrupting my thoughts. And I'm not calling to fix what happened today. Disappointment flickered before I could stop it. Then why? I asked. Because what happened today could either shrink you, he said, or sharpen you. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, completely forgetting the world around me. I don't feel sharpened, I admitted. I feel empty. That's normal, he said. Loss does that, but emptiness is also space, and space is where new things are built. The words sank in slowly. Sir, I said, I gave everything to that place. I know, he replied. And that's why they could afford to lose you. Institutions survive by replacing people. Purpose survives by finding people. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. That's why I'm calling, he said. Not as a president. As someone who's been knocked down before. There was a pause. Then he asked, if you could start fresh tomorrow, what would you build for this country? Not for a company? The question hit me harder than the firing. My mind went blank. No rehearsed answers. No safe corporate language. Just raw truth pushing its way forward. Images formed quickly. Systems that could help people like me. Tools for those who never got second chances. Ideas I'd buried because they weren't profitable enough. I'd build something that gives people dignity, I said slowly. Something that doesn't discard them the moment they're inconvenient. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. That, he said, is exactly what I hoped you'd say. We spoke for a few more minutes. Not about power or politics, but about responsibility. About using talent where it mattered most. About the difference between being employed and being useful. He didn't promise anything. He didn't need to. Before ending the call, he said one last thing. Today wasn't the end of your story. It was the removal of a distraction. The line went dead. I sat there long after, phone still pressed to my ear, the city noise rushing back in like a wave. The box at my feet no longer felt like proof of failure. It felt temporary. I stood slowly, steadier than before, and for the first time since that morning, I didn't feel lost. I felt challenged. I stayed seated long after the call ended, staring at the blank screen of my phone like it might light up again and tell me the last 10 minutes had been a mistake. My ears rang, not from sound but from meaning. The president's voice replayed in my head, steady and deliberate, each sentence echoing with a weight I wasn't sure I was ready to carry. Around me, the city moved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. A woman argued into her headset. A delivery truck honked impatiently. Somewhere, someone laughed. None of them knew my life had just cracked open. I stood up slowly, legs stiff, and picked up the cardboard box. It felt lighter now, not because anything had changed physically, but because its contents no longer defined me. I began walking again, this time with intention, though I couldn't yet name it. My mind circled around the question he had asked. If you could start fresh tomorrow, what would you build for this country, not for a company? It wasn't a hypothetical. It was a demand, and it refused to let me hide behind excuses. I found myself in a small park a few blocks away, the kind of place office workers used for lunch breaks. I sat on a bench and opened my notebook, the one I'd almost thrown away. Pages filled with half-finished ideas stared back at me. Projects I'd abandoned because no one approved the budget. Concepts dismissed as too idealistic. I flipped through them slowly, my fingers tracing lines I'd written months ago, never imagining they would matter to anyone beyond me. The president's words surfaced again. What you built mattered more than you realize. I'd always assumed impact had to be loud, visible, celebrated. I've been wrong. Some of the most important work moved silently, unnoticed until it was impossible to ignore. That realization settled into me like a truth I'd been avoiding my entire career. My phone buzzed again. This time, a message. Unknown sender. A single sentence. You don't need permission to begin. No signature. No explanation. I didn't need one. I went home and closed the door behind me, leaning against it as if holding the day outside. My apartment was quiet, almost unfamiliar in the afternoon light. I placed the box down and sat at the small table by the window. For the first time since the firing, I allowed myself to feel everything at once. The anger came first, sharp and justified. Then the humiliation. Then grief for the version of myself that believed loyalty would protect him. I let it all pass through me without fighting it. By evening, something else replaced it. Clarity. I pulled out my laptop and opened a blank document. No corporate templates. No approval chains. Just a blinking cursor waiting for honesty. I wrote without filtering, without worrying about feasibility or funding. I wrote about systems that failed people quietly. About talent wasted because it didn't fit neat boxes. About how many capable individuals were discarded simply because they didn't have connections or polished resumes. Words poured out faster than I could organize them. Around midnight, my phone rang again. This time, I answered without hesitation. It wasn't the president. It was a woman from his office, professional and precise. She didn't waste time. The president asked me to check in, she said. He wants to know what you're thinking. I looked at the document on my screen, pages filled with raw intention. I'm thinking that I've been solving the wrong problems, I said. Good, she replied. That means you're thinking honestly. She asked me to explain my ideas. I spoke slowly at first, then with growing confidence. I told her about the platform I envisioned, one that connected overlooked talent to real national needs, not through favoritism but through proof of skill and purpose. A system that valued contribution over credentials. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a sharp, clarifying question that forced me to refine my thoughts. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Then she said, "The president will want to hear this himself." I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety but from momentum. I refined diagrams, outlined steps, anticipated obstacles. Every fear that had once stopped me now felt smaller than the opportunity ahead. By morning, exhaustion set in, but it didn't slow me down. It sharpened me. 2 days later, I received a formal email. An invitation. No promises. Just a meeting. Location withheld. Time precise. I reread it several times, grounding myself in its reality. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't validation. It was responsibility knocking. The meeting room was smaller than I expected. No grandeur. No flags. Just a table, a few chairs, and the president seated across from me, hands folded, expression attentive. He gestured for me to sit. "Tell me," he said simply. I spoke for nearly an hour. Not as an employee, not as a candidate, as a citizen. I spoke about wasted potential and quiet brilliance. About how losing my job had stripped away fear I didn't realize I carried. He listened the entire time, never checking his watch, never interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back slightly. "You know," he said, "most people ask for restoration. You're asking for transformation." "I don't want my old life back," I said before thinking. "I want a better one to exist." He smiled just slightly. "Then you're ready." He didn't clap. He didn't praise. He simply nodded, as if confirming something he already believed. "This won't be easy," he said. "You will be questioned, doubted, resisted." "I know," I replied. "Good," he said. "If it were easy, it wouldn't be necessary." When I left that room, nothing about my external life had changed yet. No title, no salary, no guarantees. But internally, something irreversible had occurred. The man who had walked into work on Tuesday believing stability was safety no longer existed. In his place stood someone who understood that purpose was heavier than comfort, and far more demanding. By the time I stepped back into the daylight, I wasn't thinking about the job I'd lost. I was thinking about the work ahead. That night I didn't sleep, not because my mind was racing with fear, but because it was finally racing with direction. There is a difference between anxiety and alignment, and for the first time in my life I felt the latter. The apartment was quiet, almost reverent, as if it knew something important was happening within its walls. The city lights outside my window blinked like distant signals, unaware that a decision had already been made. I cleared my table completely. No distractions, no leftovers from my old life. Just my laptop, a notebook, and a glass of water. I wasn't building a company. I wasn't chasing funding. I was answering a question that had been placed in my hands deliberately. What would you build for this country? I started by writing the problem plainly without softening it. Too many capable people were invisible. Not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked access. Systems claimed to be merit-based, but ran on familiarity. Talent was everywhere. Opportunity was not. I had lived that truth quietly for years, watching brilliant minds fade into obscurity while louder, less capable ones climbed effortlessly. I had survived it. Others hadn't. By 2 a.m., I had drawn the first rough framework. Not polished, not impressive, honest. A platform that removed pedigree and replaced it with proof. Where your work spoke before your name. Where contribution mattered more than credentials. Where the country's hardest problems could be matched with its most overlooked minds. At dawn, my phone buzzed. Another message from the same unknown number. Begin small. Begin real. That was all. I sent one email that morning. Not to investors. Not to institutions. To 5 people I trusted. People I'd seen do extraordinary work without recognition. I told them what I was building and why. I didn't promise success. I promised meaning. By evening, 3 had replied yes. No questions. No conditions. Just belief. We met online that night, faces lit by laptop screens, all of us coming from different corners of the country. An engineer who'd been laid off twice. A data analyst stuck in contract work despite flawless results. A designer whose ideas were always used but never credited. Strangers, yet instantly familiar. Each of us carried quiet frustration and untapped resolve. This isn't a startup, I told them. And it's not a movement. It's a tool. If it works, people won't need to know who built it. There was a pause. Then the engineer smiled. That's exactly why I'm in. We worked without hierarchy, without ego. Everyone owned everything. Progress was slow but deliberate. Every decision had to answer one question. Does this give dignity back to the user? If it didn't survive. Weeks passed. The prototype took shape. Ugly at first, then functional, then powerful. It connected real problems to real solutions, anonymously at first, judged purely on output. We tested it quietly with a small public agency willing to experiment. The results were undeniable. Problems that had stalled for months were solved in days. Not because we were better, but because we were finally seen. One afternoon, as I was reviewing feedback, my phone rang. This time, the number wasn't restricted. The caller ID simply read office. You should check your email, the voice said. I opened it immediately. A formal letter. No flourish. No exaggeration. Just acknowledgement. The president's office had reviewed the early results. They wanted to observe further. Support was not promised. Scrutiny was. I smiled. Scrutiny meant relevance. Pressure followed. Questions from agencies. Requests for explanations. Doubt disguised as concern. Is this scalable? Who oversees this? What happens when it fails? I answered everything honestly. We'll fix it. We learn. We adapt. The system wasn't designed to protect itself. It was designed to serve. There were setbacks. A critical bug nearly collapsed the platform. One team member considered quitting after a public critique dismissed our work as idealistic. I didn't stop them from feeling discouraged. I reminded them why we started. If we were comfortable, I said, we'd be doing something useless. Then came the letter. Physical. Heavy paper. Signed in ink. An invitation to present, not as a pitch but as a demonstration. When I held it, I didn't feel victorious. I felt accountable. This wasn't luck. It was alignment. Everything that had been stripped away was being replaced with something heavier. The night before the presentation, I thought about the day I'd been fired. The humiliation. The silence. The cardboard box. I realized something quietly profound. That door hadn't closed to punish me. It had closed to remove excuses. I could no longer hide behind employment. I had nothing left but intention. When we presented, we didn't sell. We showed. Real cases. Real outcomes. Real people finally matched to real purpose. The room was silent when we finished. Not impressed silence. Absorbing silence. Afterward, the president approached me privately. You didn't build this out of anger, he said. You built it out of responsibility. I didn't want revenge, I replied. I wanted repair. He nodded once. Then keep going. There was no celebration that night. No applause. Just quiet resolve. The mission was no longer theoretical. It was alive. And I understood something clearly for the first time. Losing my job hadn't freed me. Choosing this had bound me to something far bigger than myself. Months passed without announcement or ceremony. No headlines. No viral moments. Just work. The kind that settles into your bones and changes the way you see time. Days blurred into nights, not because we were chasing urgency, but because the work demanded continuity. Once you saw the gaps clearly, you couldn't unsee them. Once you watched people regain dignity through contribution, you couldn't treat systems as abstract anymore. The platform grew quietly. More agencies came on board, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Problems that once required endless committees were resolved by people who had been waiting their whole lives to be useful. Every success felt less like victory and more like correction, as if something slightly crooked in the world had been nudged closer to straight. I no longer introduced myself by my former job title. In fact, I rarely spoke about it at all. That version of me felt distant now, like a previous draft that had served its purpose. My days began earlier. Not out of obligation, but out of anticipation. There was always something unfinished, something worth improving. One evening, I received another message. Simple. Direct. You are invited to meet the president. No qualifiers. No context. A date. A location. This time, there was no shock. Just a deep inhale and a quiet understanding that this meeting was different from the others. This wasn't about the work alone. It was about the person the work had reshaped. The building was quieter than I expected. No grand procession. No spectacle. I waited in a small room with a single chair and a painting I didn't recognize. When the door opened, he walked in alone. No aides. No interruptions. Just two people occupying the same space. He extended his hand. I shook it firmly, aware of the symbolism but grounded enough not to be overwhelmed by it. You look different, he said. So do you? I replied before thinking, then smiled, unsure if I'd overstepped. He laughed. Fair enough. We sat across from each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly. Do you remember the day you lost your job? He asked. I nodded. Every detail. Good, he said. Never forget it. But don't live there. He asked me about the people behind the platform. Not metrics. Not scalability. People. Their stories. Their struggles. Their transformations. I told him about the engineer who'd finally been trusted with a national problem. About the analyst whose work had prevented a crisis no one would ever publicly credit. About the quiet pride that replaced bitterness when people realized they mattered. He listened intently, hands folded, eyes steady. "This," he said finally, "is how nations heal. Not through speeches, through systems that respect their people." I told him I still doubted myself some days. That leadership felt heavier than I'd imagined. That the fear of failing those who now believed in the work kept me awake at night. He nodded. "That fear is healthy. It means you're not doing this for yourself." We stood and walked toward the window. The city stretched below us, vast and indifferent, just as it had on the day I'd been fired. But it looked different now. Not kinder, just clearer. He turned to me and said, "Sometimes you have to lose what's comfortable to discover what's possible." The words landed softly, without drama, but they stayed. I knew they would stay. When the meeting ended, there was no instruction, no directive, just trust. And with trust came responsibility far heavier than any job I'd ever held. On the way out, I passed through hallways lined with history, faces, moments, decisions that had shaped millions of lives. I didn't feel small among them. I felt appropriately placed. Not above, not beneath, within. Later that night, I sat alone in my apartment, the same one I'd returned to months earlier with a cardboard box and a broken sense of self. I thought about that version of me sitting on the sidewalk, convinced his story had ended. I wished I could tell him the truth, that endings are rarely punishments. They are edits. Now, when I think about the day I got fired, I don't feel anger. I don't feel loss. I feel gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced upon me. Comfort had been my cage. Loss had been the key. And if someone reading this feels like their world has just ended, if the ground beneath them has given way without warning, know this: sometimes what feels like collapse is actually invitation. Not to return to what was, but to step into what you were meant to build. That day didn't break me. It revealed me.